Whispers in the Dark, a Cienie short story written by Feather Page, based on the visual novel Cienie, created by Armored Stranger and Ben Binturong. Once upon a time, on a cool autumn day in Sipnivo, a brave little knight and his dearest friend roamed through the rooms of their great castle. From his bedroom to the living room, the sounds of joyful laughter echoed throughout their domain. Sir David, clad in his most shiny gallant suit of armor, charged through the realm, foam sword in hand. By his side was Tomek, his most loyal squire and friend. Together they set out on a dangerous quest to retrieve a hidden treasure, ice cream from the Forbidden Lands, the kitchen. Now they closed in on their prize, kept within an elaborate chest, the freezer. Rumors had flown around the realm that for any soul brave enough to venture into such a treacherous domain, there awaited sweet treats beyond one's imagination, and here they were, about to unveil the truth. Tom stood silently, giddy with anticipation as the black cat's ears flicked and swiveled. He liked coming to David's house for moments like this. Yes! The hyena clad in armor bounced with glee as he pulled free from those frozen depths the prize of their quest, a tub of chocolate chip flavored ice cream. Tom beamed at David's elation. At home, his own mother would only let him have ice cream on a hot summer's day, if he'd done well in school or finished all his chores. At David's, he could have it whenever he wanted, and his parents always bought the best ice cream. "I told you that they'd have it, Tomek," cheered David, his voice practically wavering with elation as he scrambled around the kitchen frantically searching for something. Tom knew that David's parents liked a tidy kitchen. As he heard the loud clangs and shoveling of kitchenware, he knew that the hyena probably wasn't putting everything back where it belonged. He folded his arms, nervously glancing towards the door. "You sure your dad won't mind?" Tom asked, as though expecting Mr. Verzosik to be standing there, waiting. David was barely listening, instead too concerned with trying to shove a very large ladle back into place after he had unceremoniously begun swinging it around like a blade. He suddenly jumped up, 2 spoons in hand, and shoved the drawer shut. "Relax, he won't care. Besides, my mom isn't home." He tucked the tub of ice cream under his arm and skipped out of the kitchen, his tail swishing from side to side with excitement. Tom let out a quiet sigh, wishing that he could live his life half as carefree as David seemed to. Both of their parents weren't around as much, always working though. Tom's father was away in the army. At least David's was around, but he seemed to spend so much time shut away in his office that Tom sometimes wondered if he was even there at all. It didn't seem to bother David very much, as he was often on his own, maybe because he still at least had his brother around from time to time. Eliash was older than the both of them by a few years, but didn't seem to mind them too much. It must have been nice, Tom thought, having an older sibling around who doesn't hate you, or even just having an older sibling at all. He used to worry that Eliash would be like the other older kids at school, thinking that they were annoying or easy to push around. He didn't care if they thought that they were annoying, but he definitely wasn't going to be pushed around. "Hey, are you coming or what?" came David's giddy tones. Tom frowned. His tail flicked in mild agitation as he snapped back to reality. Rolling his eyes, he followed his best friend's voice, passing several pictures hanging on the wall. Some landscapes that looked like they were taken in South Germany. Other family photos. He didn't stop to pay them much mind. "Fine, I'm here. What's the—" He began to grumble, before stopping in his tracks. There was David still wearing his outfit, hopping around the room as he tried to pry open the ice cream box. "Uh-oh. I think it's frozen shut. Come on." David's expression strained as he fruitlessly tried to yank the lid off the box, his teeth bared in concentration as he paced around the room, restlessly, muttering under his breath, "Stupid thing." The hyena growled with frustration, shaking his head as his annoyance only grew with each passing moment. Hey David, take it easy. You don't—" Tom began, his tail swishing from side to side with unease. He knew that David could get quite single-minded when he was determined, and he knew when David was determined he was careless. "I think I've almost—" The lid of the tub began to creak under the strain, before all of a sudden it came flying free. Seemingly unprepared for the sudden opening, David started stumbling backwards, before crashing into a coffee table, which was neatly decorated with various ornaments and household items. It began to careen backwards, sending the various items scattering across the carpet, and David sprawled out over the floor. Careless. The sound of scraping wood and tumbling objects pierced their ears, echoing throughout the house. Within moments, they could hear the sound of heavy footsteps getting closer and closer, moving at a brisk stride. Sure enough, Mr. Verzosic appeared in the doorway, a profound scowl adorning his features. He was met with the sight of David picking himself up off the floor, Tom holding a rather expensive vase, and the rest of the table's contents scattered all over the floor. There was a deafening moment of silence. Outside. David reared his head, mouth agape like he had been told some shocking news. The ice cream lay on the floor beside him, open but forgotten. Dad, it was just an accident. We're sorry. We'll be quiet, I promise. I said, go outside. Tom winced slightly at the raised voice, averting his gaze. He looked downward, pretending to be quite taken with the vase in his arms. He'd seen this scene play out plenty of times. David's father losing his patience with him. Thankfully, he hadn't looked at Tom yet, so at least none of his anger seemed to be directed at him. In fact, he didn't seem to acknowledge him at all. I'm trying to work. And you boys are causing a racket. I can hear you from my study. Now go and play outside like normal kids. David's ears drooped. While he looked a little lopsided and goofy before, he now looked sad. There was a moment of silence as Mr. Verzosic remained in the doorway, glaring down at David before he closed his eyes and reached up to massage his temples with a sigh. And tidy up before you do. He turned on the spot, moving out of sight. Not a goddamn babysitter. The faded footsteps left a lingering silence, neither of the boys having the courage to look at each other. Eventually the silence broke and they gathered their things together, the illusion of their quest well and truly shattered. Tom watched as David returned the ice cream to the freezer without a word. All the excitement that they had for the tasty treat had long since faded after Mr. Verzosic's outburst. He quietly pushed the door shut, stepping past Tom out of the kitchen as he beckoned him to the front door. A very quiet 20 minutes later, they were sitting outside on a bench, staring at the ground. David was quietly fidgeting, shifting, and squirming in place as Tom's attention seemed to be caught by a group of people in the distance. He recognized them, boys from their school, walking in their direction. Not anyone he particularly liked, though he usually kept to himself anyway. He hoped that they wouldn't notice him or at least recognize him in David. He wasn't in the mood for... It's not fair. Tom's train of thought was completely derailed. His ears flicked as he snapped himself out of his daydream, blinking as he returned to the present. What? He glanced over at David, finding himself surprised at just how crestfallen he looked. Tom suspected that this was about more than just ice cream. You weren't... It was just an accident. The hyena's lower lips trembled, somewhat as he squirmed in place, seeming to find it difficult to express the words that he wanted to say. Tom's expression fell slightly and he looked away from his friend for a moment. He remembered Mr. Verzosic as he used to be, telling Tom and David all kinds of wonderful stories and fairy tales about the tale of the wizard who solved the ancient riddle, or the knight who saved his town from monsters that came from the dungeon of an evil castle. But since his book came out, he'd been different, stressed and easily agitated. He never had the time or patience for them anymore. Tom had thought that it was because they were growing up at first, but... The group was passing by the pair of them now, hands in their pockets. A Labrador, a hedgehog, a mouse, and a bat. He recognized the bat, Mikhail. He went to the same school as them and was around the same age, but Tom didn't know him very well. He seemed to be talking, or at least, trying to talk to the Labrador beside him, who seemed intent on staring at the ground, ears drooped and flattened. Come on, dude, seriously, there were no monsters in there. David's ears perked up, lifting his head as they spoke. His head tilted to the side in that way that it always did when he had an idea. Tom knew it too well. Monsters? The group slowly came to a stop, Mikhail abruptly freezing as David spoke up. There was a momentary pause as the four kids simply stared at David, presumably because of the night costume. Tom wasn't sure if they were impressed or about to make fun of him, his ears twitching as if expecting to be the latter. Yeah, the Labrador boy spoke up, stammering over his words as though he weren't confident in saying them. He looked away, his muzzle shifting into a nervous frown, as his voice crumbled into an indiscernible mumble. Mikhail sighed, shaking his head. Tom thought that he caught the bat rolling his bright yellow eyes for a moment. He's just a little freaked out. We were just hanging out near the old administration building in KŁOMINO, and this guy, he jerked his thumb towards the Labrador, who now quietly looked down at the ground, got spooked by something. Probably just the wind, maybe a wild animal. The Labrador's expression suddenly shifted, the anxiety replaced with irritation, stamping his foot on the ground indignantly. He spoke up again, much louder this time. "I'm not joking. There was something there, like a monster." His sudden outburst led all 5 pairs of eyes to fix on him, blinking in varying degrees of surprise. This seemed to give him pause. The assertive front quickly crumbled back into the previous nervousness. Or something. David had the look in his eye, and before Tom could grab him, he suddenly leapt to his feet, tail wagging away. "Monsters, eh? Well, there'll be no match for us," he declared confidently, provoking another collective of stunned looks from everyone around him, Tom especially, because he knew that he'd be dragged into this. The idea was appealing, though, an adventure with his friend, a real one. It pushed what had happened at David's house to the back of his mind. "We'll go and take care of them, no matter what they are." Mikhail shook his head, rolling his eyes, this time without any attempt to hide it. He let out a resigned sigh as he turned on his heels, beckoning to the rest of his friends. "Fine, whatever. Just don't blame me if something happens to you, okay?" As the group shuffled away, Tom and David were left alone again on the bench, the chattering voices of Mikhail and his friends slowly fading, replaced by the quiet whispers of the wind once again. David turned to Tom, his fangs bared in an excited grin, and Tom couldn't help but smile back at him. The path to KŁOMINO was well known by the kids of their age, a place where trees and vines grew unchecked across those crumbling, seemingly ancient walks, empty and abandoned, except for, of course, the monsters that the pair had tasked themselves with cleaning out, their very own quest, which had long since led them into the woods just off the main road out of town. Tom had lost track of time a while ago, too busy keeping David on track and going the right way. He'd never been there before, but they'd been told plenty of times exactly where it was by his parents and teachers whenever they warned him to stay away. He looked over at David, happily trotting along in his armor as they walked through the woods. "Do you think that we'll find any monsters there, David?" Tom asked nonchalantly. He wasn't sure what to make of this rumor. What kind of monsters would live there anyway? "Only one way to find out," David replied, skipping along through the forest. "And we'll find out together, like we always do." Tom smiled at that, finding himself laughing along with David before he could stop himself. "Yeah, like we always do. And we always will, right?" "Always will," came David's cheery voice, like the hyena didn't have a care in the world, as if he'd already forgotten why they were out here in the woods instead of still back in his house. A few more minutes trudging through the woods and they saw it, the first of the great towering buildings of KŁOMINO, the ground beneath their feet changing from soil and mud to hard concrete, half buried by the fallen leaves. The trees had been replaced by the high-rising structures, blank and unremarkable in their appearance. Each floor was made up of the exact same number of windows of blocky, empty nothingness. Tom cast his eyes over the scene, the outdated shape of the buildings a far cry from the way that his and David's houses were built. In some ways, the buildings almost looked like prisons, like dungeons. "Sheesh, this place is creepy," David jibbed, having wandered over to one of the ground floor windows to peer inside. "Whoa, the roof's totally fallen in here. Check it out." Tom frowned, turning on his heel to move towards where David stood, his hands covering his eyes so that he could peer into the glass better. Arriving by the window, Tom squinted into the darkness. His eyes were met by a sorry scene, an abandoned kitchen, the doors hanging off their frames, with concrete rubble strewn across the floor, intermingled with scraps of foil and food packaging. It was like somebody had been here recently. Whether that was before or after the ceiling had come down was anybody's guess. I don't think that this is the dungeon that they meant," Tom muttered, tugging at David's sleeve. He looked over his shoulder, acutely aware that anything or anyone could be looking down on them from one of the windows, assuming that there was any floor on the higher levels left for them to stand on. "Come on, David. This place is empty." He pulled on David's sleeve again, harder this time, and the hyena relented. Eventually, he was peeled away from the window, which had fogged up with his breath. "Fine." They continued on, past an abandoned bicycle, as Tom dragged David along by the arm down an alleyway, and out into another section of the woods. "They said that it was near KŁOMINO, right?" David asked. Tom responded with a simple, as he led David along. They walked past high-rising buildings adorned with withering vines. The structures seemed to almost leer down at them, their windows like eyes beneath the autumn sun. The buildings were soon replaced with trees, once again the outskirts, so far turning up no monsters whatsoever. The buildings had since faded from view behind them, but it wasn't long before the pair found themselves standing outside another structure, hidden away deep in the woods. A weathered sign hung above the main entrance, barely clinging on despite the Cyrillic lettering having long since faded away. This must be the administration building, Tom thought. The boys looked over at each other, each wearing an expression of slight unease, unsure if they should continue on their quest. But with a gleeful smile, David charged forward through the doorway. "Hey David, wait!" Tom took off straight after him, under the crumbling archway which looked set to give way any day now. The interior was dark, adorned with chipped, peeling red paint, along with the dusty outlines of where picture frames may have once hung. Passing the remains of a reception desk, Tom found himself at a fork, a corridor leading left and right, and forward. The corridor ahead of him passed doors and staircases, and ended at an empty wall. "David? Where are you?" he called out, peering left and right. Silence. Tom sighed, shaking his head. "Come on, David. We can't get lost here. We should stick together." He did his best to keep calm, but for the first time since arriving in KŁOMINO, he felt isolated. The sense of adventure was slowly being replaced by the creeping dread of realizing that he was somewhere that he shouldn't be. A quiet creaking sound broke the stillness, and, dead ahead of him, something caught his eye. He thought the corridor ended in a dead wall, but as he peered through the dim light, he realized that what he thought was a wall was actually a door, intact and left ajar. It had been painted over to blend with the surrounding walls, so he probably hadn't noticed it at first. The door swung slightly open as if moved by the wind, or as if someone had gone through it recently. David, probably. Tom hurried towards the door, the idea of wandering around in here without David becoming more daunting and real by the minute. "Tom? I'm in here." He heard David's voice somewhere in the distance. He couldn't quite tell where it was coming from, but it sounded as if it was beyond the door. "David, just stay put, I'm coming." He reached the door. The Cyrillic lettering also faded. Not that Tom would be able to read much of it anyway. He had never cared much for his Russian classes in school. He pushed the door open, peering into the room before him, but he couldn't make out much. The lack of windows made it difficult to see anything. The red paint on the walls was much better preserved here, a deeper, richer shade of crimson. "David?" Tom asked tentatively. He pushed the door farther ajar, stepping forward into the darkness. As a cat, his eyes would have adjusted fast enough for him to check behind the door, just in case David was planning to jump out at him. Tom had heard loud things before, a voice being raised, a glass being dropped, but he had never heard such a terrible sound as the door behind him slamming shut. The gloomy light from outside disappeared in an instant, like a candle crudely snuffed out, sudden, abrupt, dark. Tom waited for his eyes to adjust. They always did. Even on the darkest of nights of the year, he'd lie awake in bed and make out the ceilings of his room, the shape of the things strewn across his desk. But there was nothing here. Just simple, empty blackness, like the moonless midnight sky when all the glistening stars had faded. Tom whirled around instantly. The fur on the back of his neck, prickling at his surroundings, vanished into the darkness. He charged back the way that he came, nearly crashing into the door as he fumbled with the lock, tugging, shoving, twisting, anything to get the damn thing to budge. The faintest sound of laughter echoed in his ears, laughter that he didn't recognize. "David? David?" The hyena had come running the second that he had heard the solid metal door crash shut. No sooner had Tom called his name that David was banging on the cold steel, wrestling in vain with what now separated him from his friend. "Tom? Tomic, what happened? David, please, let me out. This isn't funny. I'm trying. It won't. David!" He could hear it in Tom's words. Beneath the urgency, his voice trembled with fear, desperation, and it damn near broke David's heart. No matter how hard he pushed, pulled, or yanked, At the door, it didn't move an inch, as though it had been completely sealed, as solid as the concrete wall surrounding him, like it was never a door. Not really. Tom, David's efforts faltered, the hyena grunting and panting as he exerted all his energy on what was effectively a solid wall. I can't. David, please, don't leave me. Tom's claws instinctively extended now, and David could hear them breaking against the metal from the other side. Tom's pleas grew even shakier as his voice cracked, like when you knew someone was crying, even if you couldn't see them. David gritted his teeth, baring his fangs, and shoulder-barged the door one more time, to no avail. All he earned was a dent in his pauldron and a jolt of pain shooting up his arm. He thumped the door again with his fist, as if he could make a difference, his fist tightening in frustration. I'll be back, Tom. I'm gonna get help. David, please. I promise. It went against every fiber of his being to let his hands fall from the sealed door, to step back, to turn around and run as fast as his legs could carry him. Here he was, leaving his friend behind. But he couldn't do this, not by himself. He needed help, even if every step that he took brought him further and further away from his best friend. He sniffled, brushing his eyes with his sleeve, and continued out of the administration block at a sprint. The sound of fading footsteps filled Tom's heart with sinking despair, knowing that the only person who knew where he was had left him behind. The silence overtook David's retreating footfalls and smothering and drowning them until dread fully began to settle within him. Scared, alone, abandoned, forgotten. The words crept into his mind like the thoughts that weren't his own. Tom whirled around, staring wide-eyed into the creeping blackness. Who was there? There was no answer. His eyes flitted from left to right, searching for something, anything but that awful enveloping darkness. And that was when he saw it, or at least thought that he saw it. Something like the slightest disturbance in the dark, murky water. A shape, an outline. Outlines? How could he see anything in the pitch black darkness? Maybe it was just a poor lost animal, vermin skittering about in the dark. He wondered what else could be in here, creeping, skulking towards him. Tom could feel his heartbeat rising as breath caught in his chest, helplessly despairing at the thought that something could be mere inches away from him, and he'd have no idea. Then he heard a scratching sound. The crunch of dead leaves beneath his feet filled his ears as David sprinted to KŁOMINO. The hyena remembered the way that he came. He had a pretty good sense of direction, and it rarely let him down. He couldn't now, not while Tom was still back there, trapped, all alone, where he'd left him behind. David gritted his teeth as guilt shot through him, fangs bared as he seemed to snarl at himself. He shook his head, struggling to see the path ahead. What kind of friend was he running away when Tom needed him the most, leaving him back there all alone in the cold dark? Who would do that? Who would abandon someone that they... He reached up to brush something out of his eyes. Warm tears met the back of his palm. No, he was doing this for Tom. He needed to save him, and he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, wherever he could get it. He had to try. Resolved, David discovered a renewed energy and continued through the woods. The lifeless trees silently watched him. Tom had felt his way over to a nearby corner of the room, hugging his knees to his chest. The words that weren't words had grown louder somehow. They weren't something that he could hear, at least he didn't think so, but he knew what they meant. It was as if they were coming not from the room, but from inside of him. Fear, panic, pain, anguish, terror at the thought that it was happening and what would happen next. Tom let out a quiet sob, trying to stifle it as best as he could, as he brought his hands to his ears. He pushed them flat against his skull, but covering them only made everything louder. He shivered, whimpering a wordless plea to the sounds. The voices. Please stop. Please stop. They just seemed to goad the feeling of dread in his chest further, his heart sinking into the empty blackness all around him. You're alone. Poor little kitty. He left you behind. You should have listened. Another sob. He couldn't remember how long he'd been stuck in here now. It felt like he'd been in here forever. He couldn't remember which way the door was, only that ahead of him was an emptiness that stretched on forever, and the voices that lurked within it, and that he'd been here forever. Bang! Tom recoiled at the terrible crash, scrambling back into the corner. He made himself as small as he could, clutching his legs to his chest even tighter now as he would look around wildly, still only seeing darkness. It took every ounce of strength that he had in himself from screaming, because if he screamed, it would find him. Another awful crash. This was it, Tom thought, the monster that Mikhail and his friends had talked about. It was real and it was here, and it was going to get him. You're going to die here. A third ear-splitting crash. It sounded like it was coming closer, like it knew where Tom was. He felt exposed, as though it could see him perfectly in that pitch-black darkness, and that hiding here was useless. He let out a wail of pure terror, the waves of anxiety having simply grown too much for him to bear. Not that it mattered anymore. It was coming for him now. He could hear it, speaking, mumbling, murmuring in a language that he didn't understand. In fact, he wasn't even sure if it was speaking at all, just making sounds that sounded like speaking. There was a fourth and final crash, louder than what Tom had heard before, like it was right in front of him. He cried out, lifting his arms to cover his head before his ears were met with the sound of scraping metal. A surge of evening light poured into the room as a door was thrown wide open, slamming into the wall with a thundering bang. A tall silhouette stood in the doorway, its head swiveling from left to right as it seemed to search for something in a panic. Tom? Tom? The words almost didn't register with Tom, as the black cat remained cowering in the corner. The darkness before him was banished, replaced by the crumbling walls and broken furniture of the otherwise big, empty room. It was like he had been pulled back to reality, but his mind was still back there, lost in perpetual darkness. The figure had arrived in front of him now, kneeling down to take hold of Tom's shoulders. Hey Tom, can you hear me? Are you alright? He recognized the voice now, especially when it was accompanied by the face of its owner. Features and patterns that he knew all too well, but slightly different somehow and a little older. Eliash, David's brother. The elder sibling cracked a coy grin as he patted Tom's shoulders, desperately trying to bring the cat's attention back to the present moment. Hey Tom, it's alright. We got you. It's okay. He leaned in a little closer, the teenage hyena's face making up all of Tom's vision now. The recognition helped Tom focus, like taking hold of a rope and letting whoever held the other side pull you out of the dark water. He blinked slowly, tears streaming down his face. You gave us a fright there, but we found you. You're gonna be alright. Do you understand? He never heard Eliash like this. Normally he was aloof and carefree, but now, every word that he said made all others seem quieter, more distant. Tom nodded slowly, and he was met with a gentle smile from the hyena as he gave him another pat on the shoulder. Good. He reached up, wiping away the tears that blurred his vision, letting him see Eliash more clearly and the person standing behind him. He peered past them to get a better look, recognizing the armor almost instantly. David stood behind his brother, half cast in shadow, as he looked down at Tom, his lower lip trembling. Tom pushed himself to his feet and Eliash shifted out of the way. Eliash smiled as he watched Tom run straight past him towards David, pulling him into a tight hug without so much as a word. There they stood, bathed in the light of the doorway. Tom sat in the back of his mother's car, back on the main road. He stared out of the window, his eyes now mostly dried. The sun was about to set, casting a final orange glow across the evening sky that matched the autumn leaves. David had run into Eliash not far from here, who had come looking for them after he returned home. He just happened to run into Mikhail and his gang, who told him about David and the monsters in KŁOMINO, and he came looking. Of course, Eliash called his mother, who in turn called Tom's. Tom had never felt happier to see his mother than when he saw her car waiting for them by the side of the road. He ran to her, where she met him with a warm, gentle hug. She brushed a few stray leaves off of him, fixed the fur around his eyes as he wiped away the last of his tears, and told him to wait by the car. Now the adults were standing by the side of the road, having a grown-up talk with Eliash in tow, who didn't seem to want to be there judging by his crossed arms and vague shrugs. Tom couldn't hear them. Their voices were muffled by the windows, but he could tell by their body language that there was an argument. Both his own mother and David's were snarling and pointing at Mr. Vajosik, shaking their heads. Miss Vajosik seemed to point at her own head, quite aggressively, like someone does when saying something along the lines of, "Are you crazy?" Mr. Vajosik simply leaned against the car hood, with his arms folded, seeming to snap back at his wife. Tom made out the words babysitter before Miss Vajosik suddenly raised her voice loud enough for Tom to hear. Our son and his friend could have been hurt out here, and all you can think about is your goddamn book. Tom winced slightly, looking away from the four of them and pretending not to listen. His eyes moved to the Vajosic's car, where he found David staring back at him, as he had been for a while. The hyena had changed out of his costume now, no doubt due to how dirty and scuffed it had become. The two locked eyes for a moment before David brought a hand up to the window, waving at him. Tom smiled weakly back, returning the wave. David had come back for him, just like a real knight would. No matter what happened after today, Tom would remember that. He was glad to have someone like David for a friend, someone who wouldn't leave him behind. The end. And that was Whispers in the Dark, a Cienie short story, written by Feather Page, based on the VN Cienie, created by Armored Stranger and Binturong. Narrated by me, Nero. I hope you enjoyed it.